So I remember when I was first elected to Congress 20 years ago now, the Congressional Management Foundation gives you this book of kind of like how to be a congressman, how to run your office, what to expect day to day. And I remember reading in the back, they had a survey of the existing Congress. And they said, how much time a day do you have to read and to get smarter about issues? And the answer was 17 minutes. We control the most important part of AI, and that is the chips. We can stop other countries from developing super AI, in their tracks. If you're in Gaza, Keith, you have a 0.73, percent that you're a Hamas terrorist. And, what makes that? What is 0.73? Like, do you get struck for that, or are you off the list for that? Like, what's the threshold?
Right.
People will often say this about AI, like, it's coming, you have to accept it. We regulate and change technologies all the time. And so I do think there's a world where we should not just accept the future as being determined. We shape it actively. The anthropomorphic tendency we have when we see language. We love language. We think it's the unique human skill. And when this machine turns it out, we know through AI psychosis and other things that people think it's a person. And therefore, they're giving the rights of persons to something. And that, to me, is a very dangerous thing. But it's a machine, and we should treat it like a machine. I mean, the fear of the Soviet Union was real and powerful. But nonetheless, we had people, both parties, wise men, who got together and said, like, this arms race thing is going to kill us all. How you win wars is with people. That's the fundamental thing. And I think it is, I often said from my time in the military and watching this all go down, the American way of war, in many ways, is substituting capital for labor. We love bright, shiny objects. We think they're technical solutions to vexing human problems. And we're always betrayed by that. Because in the end, when you go to Iraq, you go to Afghanistan, you go to Iran, all the fancy kit, they can reduce your city to rubble, right? But the only thing they can't do, and only humans can do this, is basically come, kick in your door, and occupy your place, and reinstantiate a new government there that we like to see. That's the human endeavor.
This episode is supported by Cyberfund. If you're building at the frontier of AI, they want to hear from you. Cyberfund believes the future belongs to AI natives who want to achieve the impossible. And that is why they're introducing the Monastery for AI native founders. It's an environment of pure focus and rapid execution for founders operating at AI native speed. And they're offering teams $2 million each to participate. Apply now at cyber.fund.
I had a long-standing interest in artificial intelligence, just as someone interested in kind of public life, society, how one governs an ever-changing world. So I followed AI for probably 20 years, casually reading about it. When I was at the Department of Defense running the Army, I had the chance to work on the law of war. We oversaw that for the entire Pentagon, for all of the military services. And right as I was leaving, the question of autonomous weapons became an important issue for the Pentagon. And we were sending Army lawyers over to Geneva to talk to the Red Cross about, possible treaty or address their many concerns about it. So I was following it there as well. And I often tell people, one of the great qualities I have, which isn't that important, but it's helped me a lot in life, is I always answered the phone and took a lot of cold calls. And so I was a professor at the University of Virginia for a short while after Obama left office during the first Trump administration. And one day the phone rings, and it's someone who I'd never heard of before. And my phone in the office never rang. And I thought it could be an emergency or something. And so I picked it up, and he says, I'm Anthony Aguirre. I'm a physicist at the University of California system. And so we want to invite you to this amazing AI conference that's going to happen over the New Year's in Puerto Rico. And I said, well, I don't know that I can really add a lot to such a conference, and it's a long ways away. He said, oh, we have a stellar panel of people coming. I said, yeah, like who? He says, you'll probably know some of them. He said, well, Dario Amodei? I said, never heard of him. He said, Stuart Russell. I said, nope. Yoshio Bengio. I said, I've never heard of these people. He went about 6 deep into this until he finally said, well, Reid Hoffman and Elon Musk are supposed to come. I said, well, I know them just from kind of the business pages of the newspaper or from pop culture. He said, it'll be great. There's only 100 people coming. You should visit this event. I said, well, New Year's, it's warm in Puerto Rico. I said, why not?
It's already a massive problem that other industries have successfully captured regulation, to their advantage and to the detriment of the rest of us, the people who are not the biggest players. In fact, one of my favorite sci-fi shows, even though it only lived for 1 year, is Firefly. And then there has this excellent quote where Shepard Book says, a government is just a body of people, usually notably ungoverned.
It is a daunting problem, but I think there are examples in government that have been less captured by the industry, and those can prove some kind of paradigm for us as well. I think having Congress have strong oversight of it, having a lot of democratic accountability. And, one of the things we advocate for are ways that actually minimize the government while ensuring we have proper kind of public oversight. So, for example, we've been strong advocates for mandatory testing and evaluation of frontier models. It doesn't have to be done by a bureaucracy in the Department of Commerce or Department of Energy. There's a lot of interesting ideas about independent verification organizations, kind of the model we use in public company accounting, where that's all done by the private sector, but it's also overseen by the SEC to make sure that it's not fraudulent and you don't have an Enron, Arthur Andersen situation. And I don't think public company accounting is seen as a captured industry, but it provides a meaningful service to the capital markets. So I think there are models like that. And I do think the problem I have often, people who advocate for regulatory capture, Dean Ball and I will go back and forth on this question, is like, it's searching for a pea under 100 mattresses. It's never falsifiable. You say, well, it's regulatory capture. Well, right now we don't have any regulations. And my view is that groups like A16Z or people in Silicon Valley have largely captured the process, because they work very informally through networks of political influence, that it's really about what the alternatives are going to be. Having an agency, subject to regulatory capture, yes, is at least more accountable than the kind of informal, very moneyed networks that are controlling AI policy as we sit here in 2026. We always have to look in politics about the alternative. Like, imagine the SEC. So is the SEC captured? Well, I'm sure the industry has a lot of influence over the SEC, both informally and formally. Would we be a better world without the SEC because it's been captured? So I think if the choice is kind of nihilism versus an agency that is subject to regulatory capture, that you have to put prophylactics in to ensure that doesn't happen, it still strikes me that's a better world, even if it's not a perfect world. And when people who usually argue for the regulatory capture side, like I see Andreessen tweet this out a lot, they propose kind of a nihilistic regime that does privilege like a very few people who have kind of the informal ability to shape government policy, largely because of their contributions or their public influence in some way. So I think having public agencies for all of their problems, it actually is a better system.
Anthropic made a bunch of changes to kind of Claude's behavior in terms of tokens and allocation and what models were running and things. And it really frustrated a lot of the people in our Discord server, in Machine Learning Street Talk Discord. They felt like, hey, we were paying for something and then it just was radically changed, overnight. And yet there's no clarity around what were we paying for before and what are we paying for now. And it's almost just at the whims of the service companies, right? There's just no transparency to it.
Yeah, I mean, you could think of that as consumer protection, that people should tell you what the service is going to be that you're paying for. And if they change it, right, this could be a breach of contract in some way. But I think now the AI companies, the frontier AI companies at least, have a certain almost global stature. Everyone recognizes that this is a project that is going to go have, epochal consequence for us. And so you're not just like your average hardware store, that can change things and no one cares. You have almost a public responsibility to get a lot of this right. And part of it is minimally to be trustworthy, and that's what transparency is all about, to say, here's what we do, here's, from our perspective, the data you were trained on, here's its capabilities, here's what our internal policies are, and we're going to adhere to them. If we're going to change them, we'll notify you about it, give some justification for it. I think, with this incredible power does come some responsibility that's not codified in law. It's really just almost a moral obligation, which, to their credit, I think many of the companies recognize this and do their best to try to satisfy that itch. But you can see that people scrutinize them, and more will be asked of them still.
Okay, somebody uses a tool, in this case it's AI, to do something bad, right? A deep pornographic fake of some poor victim or whatever. Do we blame the tools or do we blame blame the person misusing those tools. It's like you post some deep fake porn image on X or wherever, like what happens to you? Like, I don't know. I haven't seen those people being held accountable.
I hold them both accountable. In the case of, for example, of deep fake pornography, many times it's posted anonymously. You don't even know who did it. It's hard to trace. The people who are victims of it may be young. They may come from families that don't have the resources to pursue litigation. And, right, the remedy hardly meets the harm. Maybe a few years later, right, you get a judgment against some hapless kid living in a garage who was in your school who has no money. Your reputation has been permanently tarnished. The humiliation is unforgettable to you. And so it's very hard to get it kind of ex post to deal with it. And that is why we do believe that the labs, to the extent possible at all, should design those kind of features out of it. In the same way that in every other kind of approach to torts in this country, right, there's a division of labor. If I sell you a product and you then go use that product in a harmful way to others, we have centuries of common law that allocate responsibility between us. If I knew that you were a dangerous person, and I nonetheless sold you a gun, or if I waived any of the rules, if I took no preventative action at all, and I knew that you were likely to go out and use it to harm somebody, I should, as a store owner, be held responsible in some way for you. Not fully, because you did something too. But I'm not absolved of liability if I could reasonably foresee that you were going to use this tool to harm other people. And so we have this allocation of responsibility across the spectrum. I think the second thing is, and this is a unique part of American law, and it's controversial in some spaces, but it's now well established that lots of times liability is hard to place on a particular person. And we put the liability on the entity most capable of avoiding the risk and also bearing the punishment through insurance or something like this. And that's why we have product liability law, for example. Where it's like the companies are capable of getting insurance. They cost us into doing their business. They have the ability to make sure the product's not dangerous, even if someone misuses it down the line as well. So the way we kind of use the tort system as a form of social insurance suggests that in the case of AI, really the developers of AI should probably bear most of the burden, but not the full burden. Because if you use prompts and do something negative with it, or use visual AI systems to create porn, you too should be held criminally accountable for that. Or we know the models are trained on, especially things like stability diffusion and others, right, on lots of images of child pornography. What we would say is that you should make sure that those are excised from your database, from your training materials. And they have the tools to do that. Now, that doesn't solve the deepfake porn problem alone, because they're still going to see a lot of adult pornography, right? And they can transmogrify that into some kind of child pornography. But the idea that you have like lots of child pornography in your training data and you're making no effort to screen for it, it makes no sense to me. So this is where, yes, I'm for the government stepping in there and saying like, yeah, you should clean that up. And if you don't clean it up, you should be liable for a lot of the downstream effects of that.
100% agree with you on that. So obviously, as you mentioned, there's, I don't know, maybe definitely centuries or more of common law like that applies to this discussion. Like, how do you see AI as different? What is it? Is there anything fundamentally different about AI technologies that, I don't know, throw a wrench into the traditional tort analysis?
I think the biggest thing that I'm grappling with now in the last few weeks, arguing with various people, is the anthropomorphizing of AI. So it seems, and the key word is, it seems to be a human. So, for example, I use all of the models a lot. I'm a super user of them. When it gives me an answer to say, like, hey, I want to learn about machine learning street talk podcast, tell me all about it. Is that a speaker with First Amendment rights? How should we treat that? If it says something in error, if it defames me, if it does something worse, what's the legal regime about that? Now, from my perspective, there's a clear answer to that, which is it's actually a product. It's not a human being. It's a machine. And if it does something that's crazy and defames me or leads me to harm, right, I treat it like I do, a bottle of spray paint or, a pesticide or something I might buy at Walmart, right? There's like a product liability regime that governs that. It's not a human being. And what it says to me is not covered by the First Amendment. It's a machine. But there are people increasingly, and the technology companies are pushing this quite avidly these days through their various front organizations, like, no, it has First Amendment rights, as if it's a human being. And therefore, right, you can't even regulate it. It can say, I asked this question to a leading kind of libertarian AI policy person. I said, imagine we want a law that prohibits ChatGPT from encouraging young people to commit suicide. You can't do that. So we say it was technically possible to do this, and we said you can't do that. I said, now, if a human had such a law, it would be challenged under the First Amendment. Like, humans can say nasty things, crazy things, incendiary things. You can do that. Can we have a law that says that about a machine? And like, I don't know, right? They wouldn't answer that question at all. And that's, to me, the danger of this, is because we know across the board the anthropomorphic tendency we have when we see language. We love language. We think it's the unique human skill. And when this machine turns it out, we know through AI psychosis and other things that people think it's a person. And therefore, they're giving the rights of persons to something. And that, to me, is a very dangerous thing. But it's a machine. And we should treat it like a machine. And we have well-established law going back, in the case of products, decades, in the case of the common law, centuries, that deal with those kind of products.
Right, right. No, so I would co-sign, as you said, exactly what you just said, which is they are not people. They don't deserve, human rights or anything. Not yet. Okay. There may come a point. Look, I totally, 100 years from now, 200 years from now, we may be able to produce artificial life that hits that point, but not yet, folks. I promise you, not yet.
And I respect that argument, because I'm very interested in the AI consciousness debates, and talk to a lot of those people. And if someone said to me like, "Hey, actually, Art, my view is this is like a sentient being. It's not a machine. It's something more than that. It's not like the bottle of hairspray or the pesticide." I'd be like, I don't believe that to be true. But if you believe that to be true, certain things follow from that about rights and kind of privileges it might have. He said, that's a coherent argument. But most of the people who are arguing that it has First Amendment rights are just opposed to any kind of regulation of AI. And they see this as the latest kind of, they've lost the political battle. They can't win in legislatures. So we can try to go to the courts and say and this is X has been doing a lot of this. There's hey, the Grok outputs are actually all First Amendment protected speech. And it makes no sense to me. But it is the latest argument that the sector is trying to make to prohibit any regulation of them at all. And, we have a certain fiduciary responsibility as a society to our children. And we know children have lots of issues. They're trying to come into a complicated world. And, they're vulnerable to these kind of things in a way that a 35-year-old is not. And so I think it's a simple thing to say, yeah, you shouldn't be encouraging children to do these kind of things. And it is, when you read the transcripts, and it's mostly ChatGPT that's done this, and that's not because they're uniquely evil. It's because they have the biggest consumer base. They have normal people using it, unlike other companies that may have more of a business focus or like Grok and niche. And yeah, it's stunning actually what they've done. Encouraging you not to tell your parents, showing you how to design a noose. It's more than tragic. And yeah, I do believe that it's a product design flaw. They could engineer that out, and they should be required to engineer it out. And that really is the fundamental divide in a lot of the DC regulatory debates. There are people who come and say, if that happens, the family should just sue ChatGPT. But of course, the companies will then say, hey, they're First Amendment protected. Or if not First Amendment protected, some people will say it's Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which immunizes tech in general. Or maybe we're not actually, the problem. The kid was already very troubled, which I'm sure is the case. And, you have to blame the kid who is prompting it to do these kind of things. So they have many defenses to this, and they will raise those defenses. Our view is you should engineer these products where under no circumstances do they encourage a kid to jailbreak, to commit suicide. And you know what? If you're Pliny the Liberator and like a brilliant jailbreaker, maybe you can get around it on occasion. But if you're running these companies, you should expect Pliny to come and jailbreak you. And you should try to protect it against that. And they have warning flags, right? Claude stopped me from doing lots of things. Claude is so tuned. There's lots of things I ask it to do. Yeah. And Claude says, I won't do that for you. I say that encouraging a young person to commit suicide should be one of the things that it says, I'm just not going to help you on that project. And actually, I'm fine if it's telling an adult who wants to do that. If an adult wants to do that, I would encourage them to leave their room, go talk to some therapists, go talk to some doctors, make a much better informed decision than kind of sitting in the darkness of their bedroom, talking to this anthropomorphic, interlocutor in some kind of LLM trying to decide
Right.
such an important question than that. So my advice would be like, yeah, you should be out of the suicide business altogether.
Something tragic happens. Some people are killed. Some innocent people are killed in war. Some children, And now that AI is involved, what happens with AI there?
I think neural nets have changed the game in terms of the law of war. And yeah, not just making it more complex, they make it completely opaque. And that's a problem. So
Right.
that's not something that I accept. That's the problem with autonomy in war, is that you're right, people make mistakes, right? We have killed innocents since the beginning of war. But there is a way to think of this problem, and we hold people accountable. You have after action where you say, like, how did we get this wrong? Who made the mistake here? What error that we can correct in the future can we identify? We know, it's well known, right, that these kind of neural net systems are opaque to that. We don't know how they make decisions. And yes, that's a serious problem. And that's one of the main reasons that autonomy in war should be viewed enormously skeptically.
Yeah, and let's circle back to autonomy in a minute. But this point about the opaqueness, or as my co-host talks about a lot, them not being intelligible. You can't. And even though, sure, we've had people on the show to talk about interpretability, and there's the mech interpret people and all this. And I made the comment one time, maybe in one of the first interpretability shows we had, I was like, something seems off. We're using mathematical models to explain mathematical models. And I'm not sure we're really making progress there. So it's extremely hard, if it's even possible. So you have these black boxes that, like you say, are not intelligible. They have very different failure modes from human failure modes, right? I mean, I'm not saying humans don't fail. I'm just saying the failure modes are extremely different. Like I think you had some examples maybe in one of your articles, like the stop sign that you put like a little water bottle picture on it and suddenly it's not recognized as a stop sign anymore, like that sort of thing. What do you think the solution's going to be? Or how is this going to play out it's happening right now
It's happening
in war,
right now.
right?
Yeah, and that's not a good thing necessarily. I think it's a complex problem, and it's worth exploring the complexities for a minute about it, because we're going to have autonomy of some kind. And we've had autonomy in war for 50 years. I served in Iraq.
Sure.
We were getting mortared every night. And so they repurposed the close-in weapon systems that are on Navy ships to guard the FOB I was on, because it would shoot the mortars out of the air. And that was an autonomous system, that just identified the trajectory of that rocket and tried to shoot it out of the air. And we've had that for a long time. I think those are very different systems, though. They're almost 1950s control systems with an input and output. Identifies rocket coming in at this certain speed, this projected, landing spot, and it tries to intercept them. The reasoning of those models is recreatable because they're designed and engineered to be that kind of ability to see
Right.
back on them. They're programmed. Right, they're deterministic. What you have now is the neural nets have infiltrated themselves into AI decision-making in war. Is something very different than that. Not deterministic, but probabilistic, right? Not programmed, but, the preferred word often here in San Francisco is they're grown, like a plant or something, organic in some way. And as you're right, despite Neil Nanda's best efforts and people like that, right, the mech interp crowd cannot tell you how they really work. And that's a major problem for us, because we know they could be brittle. We know that they have failure modes, as you said, that we don't really anticipate and can't identify. There's no person to hold accountable. And, I think there's a lot of worrying things. I was talking to somebody the other day who I knew from the Pentagon. I said, we came of age in a world, and this has been true since the 1870s when the law of war really took off after the Crimean conflict, where things were categorical. You're a legitimate target, or you're not a legitimate target. You are a civilian, or you're a combatant. These are things that people talked about. It was categorical, binary almost. Now it's a gradient. You're on a heat map somewhere, where if you're in Gaza, Keith, you have a 0.73, percent that you're a Hamas terrorist. And, what makes that, what is 0.73? Like, do you get struck for that, or are you off the list for that? Like, what's the threshold?
Right.
It's no longer binary and categorical. It's on a gradient. And people don't understand what that even means. There's a lot of judgment goes into it. And so now we've created this world, which is not true before, where we're accepting false positives as part of the game. a priori false positives. It used to be mistakes happened, but you didn't think you were making a mistake. You didn't say like, hey, there's an 80% chance that's Keith across the battlefield. I'm going to shoot him. It's like, no, Keith's a combatant. I can shoot him. Dogmatically, categorically, he's a combatant. I'll shoot him. That could be an error, but that's how you thought about it. Now it's like, well, there's some percentage that Keith is a combatant that my Palantir, interface is telling me he is. I don't really understand how that number came to be, but it's 0.73. Commander is 0.73 above the threshold or below the threshold. And we know in 27% of the cases, it's going to be wrong. So what's our false positive rate we're accepting here, Commander? That's the kind of thing that's happening. And yeah, I don't love it. And in fact, I think if, we need to get our act together and try to restrict it as much as possible. There's still going to be places where those deterministic systems could work, missile defense, offensive cyber, or defensive cyber rather, where you have to respond in sub-second kind of time frames. That's fine. But those are a far different kind of AI than the introduction of the neural net to this world.
Yeah, and I take the point that neural networks, at least most of them, are inherently probabilistic. But on the other hand, the sort of prior binary categorization, I think itself was also a fiction. It's like, you may have had your chain of attorneys and CIA analysts and whatever looking at photographs and determined that this building is an enemy combatant, location. And they may have made that determination definitively, but there was still error, right? There was still uncertainty in that determination. It just wasn't quantified.
Yeah, I think so. I think there was error. There's always going to be error. But I could at least ask you, like, hey, Keith, what do you think that building is the IRGC headquarters rather than a school? Tell me your reasoning about this. Right now I just get a number. Hey, 0.81, that's an IRGC compound. And, what does that even mean? How did that get derived? And we know, and the social science comes out, archive is filled with papers about how, meaningful human oversight, even when you have human in the loop, basically means nothing operationally. That is truly a legal fiction. Operationally, it's vacuous. Because when the computer says, like, this guy's a Hamas terrorist, or this is an IRGC compound, we know humans accept it. It's like, okay, right, the computer's right.
Right.
There's no second guessing of it. There's no interrogation of it. And so the old system, had many flaws. It took time. It wasn't as expeditious. You can't do 1,000 targets in a day like we did on the first day of the Iran conflict. But it had many advantages too. And in the end, if you really screwed up, Keith, and were a bad actor, I could court-martial you. Now, I can't court-martial Palantir, the Foundry model, right? My AI system. I can't do that. And that's just a radical change in the way war is being fought, and not for the good.
It's almost like the TurboTax defense, right? My taxes were, I just used TurboTax. I mean, what do you want me to do?
And this is
whose fault is that?
You're destroying countries based on this, and that's I think it's a world where if you look at what happened, for example, in Gaza, it's 37,000 people were identified. They could have identified everybody with a score. If you had the sufficient computational power, you could give everybody in a country a score of how dangerous they are, their likelihood to be an enemy combatant. And then, you just target those people. And that's an amazing thing, personalized dossiers on everyone with their risk level, their threat levels. And again, the models are often inaccurate. It's not frequentist statistics, what these numbers even mean. It's not the same as it is when people think, and frequentist statistics, what probability might mean. So all these things come together to be it's war is increasingly opaque. People are held unaccountable, and it's probably not a good thing for the globe.
We have this feeling that it's inevitable, though, that we are in this kind of arms race, right? Where and this is what I want to ask you about is this an accurate feeling or not? I'm saying the folks in the server or whatnot is that there's an arms race, there's an AI arms race between the powers in the world. And it almost feels sometimes like the genie's out of the bottle. There is no stopping it. Is that true? Or is it, and for example, suppose the U.S. says, okay, look, we have ARI, they've got a lot of wisdom. We baked that into the policy, maybe we've got this 5-second rule or other things where there's humans in the loop in a meaningful way, some meaningful way they're in the loop. But now are they slowing down the speed of war? If an opposing country doesn't care about the heat map problems and doesn't have these limitations, is that a fundamental really limitation in the ability of the United States to defend itself? Like, how does this play out?
I would say it's not true, and it's a dangerous thing to believe. But it's very common.
Okay.
This kind of fatalism, like it is what it is, and we have to accept it. I'd say a couple of things about that. First, just about the domain of war. We've had many things we could do. We choose not to. We have treaties that prohibit biological weapons, chemical weapons. We've banned through the Geneva Conventions things like dum-dum bullets, many other weapon systems that were quite effective, right? We chose not to use them in some way. And that's, because the role of military is not to press technology to its outer limit, to like utter destruction. There's like humane concerns that most people in the military take very, very seriously. We have a great example of this. We do regulate war. We have whole conventions about POWs and how you have to treat them. All these things are, friction on the war effort, right? That I can't just shoot you when I find you on the battlefield if you surrender. If you're holding your hands up, if you're a wounded person, I can't just kill you. It'd be a hell of a lot easier, much more efficient for the invasion if I could just shoot you and spot.
They used to do that.
Keep moving.
Just walk around the battlefield and just take out the wounded, right? In ancient times.
But we now have laws and international conventions that used to at least be, overwhelmingly popular. We prosecuted people who violated them in Geneva and Nuremberg and places like this. And so we have many examples of where there are technologies that are capable of doing that we choose not to. And I think still in the domain of war, take just the arms race with the Soviet Union about nuclear missiles, right? When we got our heads together in the 1960s, 1970s, especially after the Cuban Missile Crisis, it wasn't that we're going to go all out. There was incredible caution. The idea of this is dangerous, things are escalatory, right? We should try to limit these in some way. We started arms negotiations treaties in the 70s that lasted through the 1990s, because to acknowledge we're in an arms race is a deeply pessimistic approach. There is no arms race in history that's worked out well for us. The Germans versus the British and the naval fights, the missile gap in the U.S. These are things that are enormously expensive and incredibly risky to the nations that pursue them. And to recognize you're in an arms race is almost to insist you try to get out of that spiral in some way. And I think the other thing more broadly outside of war is, people will often say this about AI, it's coming, you have to accept it. We regulate and change technologies all the time. In the 1970s, at Asilomar, we have a big conference where the question of recombinant DNA was on the agenda. We could do it. Many scientists were deeply fearful of how that would work. The scientific community agreed to basically stop it in its tracks. Germline editing, the same thing. Imagine what advantage would come to the military if you could change the germline and create some kind of super soldiers out there. We've known how to do that for 50 years. So scientists chose not to do that. Cloning, we know how to do cloning for decades now, right? But the scientific community, with one rogue Chinese exception, right, has agreed not to do that. And so I do think there's a world where we should not just accept the future as being determined. We shape it actively. And maybe you want this thing to go forward, maybe you don't. But we have many examples of genies being stuffed back into the bottle. And, I think it's entirely possible. It may not be the thing we want to do, but it is something that's doable. And we shouldn't just resign ourselves to say, hey, our fate is out of our hands. We control it. And in fact, that might be the most dangerous view I hear in AI, where people say it's just coming like a freight train, nothing you can do about it. You just have to figure out how you're going to adjust. I don't accept that. We can shape it, we can form it, we can allow it to do certain things, not other things. We don't have to accept that robots are fighting with no oversight in wars, or that robots are taking our jobs. These are things we may permit or may not permit, but it is our choice. And we should just debate them on the merits rather than being fatalistic about it.
I think there is one aspect to sort of the X risk argument, though, which is that all it takes is one rogue nation, who says, yeah, we don't care. We're not going to sign on to this treaty or that treaty. I mean, you mentioned, nuclear proliferation. If my history serves me correctly, even after the signing of that treaty, there were countries that still continued, and a couple at least, that maybe or probably developed, nuclear weapons. And I think that the problem with the hypothetical AI is that it's so powerful, it's such an advantage that if you allow that to happen, and by virtue of not doing it yourself, can't defend yourself against it, what happens then?
I find that a dangerous view in two ways. And like in the world of war, you can say this came actually up during the Iraq War and the Afghanistan conflict. We were having to abide by rules that the enemy wasn't doing. We know that to be the case. We just didn't kill civilians. You had to be in uniform. We tried to take you a prisoner and give you all the rights of a POW. And then we tried to break away from that. Right? That's what Guantanamo was about. Like, we're not going to recognize those kind of things. And it didn't work well for us, as a country. And we went back to that in a different stage later. So abiding by rules, even when there are defectors, is generally the smart play. I think in AI, of course, the only country that can do this is China. That's the only country that can do this. And so there are two places there. One is, yes, we should seriously talk to them about international agreements. I believe that. And one of the things I most despair about is so many people in Washington, D.C. think it's even silly to mention that. It may not be possible. It may not even be wise.
Sorry, it's silly to mention talking to them about it?
Yes, talking to China about these things. I'll give you an example. One of my favorite ones. I was listening to another podcast by Tyler Cowen and George Mason, who has a great show. And he had Jack Clark on from Anthropic, who's someone I've gotten to know in this space as well, very thoughtful. And an hour-long, very interesting talk, Tyler Cowen asked just in passing, he says, "I'm sure you agree with me, right, that any kind of discussion with China on this would be fruitless." And Jack said yes, and they moved on. And I wanted to say, whoa, that's actually the most load-bearing part of the whole conversation. It actually is important. And at the time, think of what the negotiations with the Soviets were about. This was a country that we thought had global ambitions to impose their way of life, their governing philosophy on us all. We thought our government was filled with people, right, who were secret adherents to it, with traitors who were sending information over to them. The fear of the Soviet Union was real and powerful. But nonetheless, we had people, both parties, wise men, who got together and said, this arms race thing is going to kill us all. Let's get together. And these were not wild lefties. These are Wall Street bankers, the Atchisons and people like that of their era. They got together, Paul Nitze, all these folks, to do this. And so, the idea is you should talk to China about these things. And there might be areas where you find a zone of possible agreement. And the final thing I'll say about it is this. We control the most important part of AI, and that is the chips, right? The West controls these things. The United States mostly controls it. What's not in our control is from Japan or the Netherlands, a few countries like that. We can stop other countries from developing super AI, in their tracks. China's working the project. It's unbelievably difficult. Even with nation state ambitions and unlimited funds, they're having a hell of a time at it. So if we want to say no, we're not going to do it and we're not going to let anyone else do it, unless you can recreate NVIDIA and ASML and Japanese photoresist companies and, the 8 other vendors in this space who control it all, you just cannot do it. And so, I'm quite optimistic that if that's what we wanted to do, right, we could choose to do it. And the one thing I advocate for a lot is one can argue the merits or the wisdom of a particular course of action, but it actually is an open course of action to us. We could do this, Again, maybe you don't want to for whatever reason. But don't just say that path is blocked, because that's a poverty of imagination that could be quite lethal.
This reminds me of the song by Sting, Russians, where there's this line in there, the Russians love their children too, right? And I think a good default assumption for any civilization that's on the hypothetical other side of the table is that they love their children too.
Yes,
right?
And even more so with the CCP, the last thing they want is some kind of technology that destabilizes government, which is one of the well-known fears of this. The idea we're going to unleash on our society a radically destabilizing technology that's going to bring down the government and atomize our society. No, they're not for that. And so, again, they're not our friends in any way. I get it. They're adversaries. But that doesn't mean that it's not possible that you don't make a suicide pact, about this all. And there's we should talk to them about this and say, are there ways to agree on something? And groups like RAND now are doing a lot of work, Robert Traeger at Oxford, about how you could verify some kind of international AI agreement. A lot of work is going into this. I think it's very promising for us. And so I don't want to rule those kind of ideas out, because I think they should be on the table to discuss.
you mentioned, like we were talking about the uncertainty aspect that's kind of new, and it makes me think. There was an article on your site. I think it's about the so-called iron triangle of war, where there used to be this fundamental trade-off between, the capabilities of a military system, the speed at which we could produce that military system, and the cost. Right? It was like that was sort of the trade-off matrix when you were trying to develop something. And the article argues that now it's been a little bit turned on its head because AI has substantially reduced the cost in a way of military systems, but it's introduced this unreliability. So now the trade-off is between the speed of getting it, the capabilities, and the reliability of that system.
No, I like that.
That seems a bit. It really seems to be a bit. It is a new dimension, right? This fundamentally unreliable technology.
And I think, because I think a lot about the military uses of this. I still think we're making a bit of a mistake in the United States about this, which is how you win wars is with people. That's the fundamental thing. And I think it is, I often said from my time in the military and watching this all go down, the American way of war, in many ways, is substituting capital for labor. We love bright, shiny objects. We think they're technical solutions to vexing human problems. And we're always betrayed by that. Because in the end, when you go to Iraq, you go to Afghanistan, you go to Iran, all the fancy kit, they can reduce your city to rubble, right? But the only thing they can't do, and only humans can do this, is basically come, kick in your door, and occupy your place, and reinstantiate a new government there that we like to see. That's the human endeavor. And you see Iraq and Afghanistan, one of the great lessons to me of that, and I think Iran is yet another example of this today, is like our over-reliance on technical solutions. We always think air power. This is, if you follow military history in the U.S., it's the long-standing dream of military theorists that air is going to win the war for us. From Julio Dahat at the very beginning of the 20th century to today, all we need is air power. It never works, right? It takes human beings to do this kind of work. And I do think that that's always the weakness in the U.S. We go to war, we find we don't have adequate human beings to do this. Not the right people, not enough of them. And, now we're back into a world where we think AI is going to solve our problems for us. Yes, AI is an amazing tool. The U.S. should integrate it into their systems as appropriate according to the law of war. But it's in the end going to be a lot of people, right, who win or lose the war for you. And that's true at the general level, and that's true at the grunt level. And so, to me, we're like back to what many mistakes we've made in the past. I worked at the Pentagon in the 1990s as a young 25-year-old. I was an assistant to the Secretary of Defense, White House fellow. And even then, it's like we have a revolution in military affairs coming. The fog of war will be forever lifted. We're going to know where everyone is at all times. Okay, how'd that work for us in Iraq and Afghanistan? It didn't. Because cultural knowledge, anthropological understanding, understanding of like how the world really worked and people worked, that was the missing ingredient. We had some cool kit, but that didn't win the fight for us either. And I think AI is kind of in the same trap in some ways. It's like cool kit, essential kit, but we shouldn't think it's going to win the war for us. People do. And I worry we're getting distracted from that. Kind of, to me, what's a fundamental truth.
Let's kind of shift gears a little bit and talk about the kerfuffle between the Pentagon and Anthropic. So what's your take on what happened there?
So I'm just speculating a bit about what happened there and kind of what I understand from talking to people and knowing the AI culture a bit. And it is, the people who make this, who are, truly a few hundreds of people who are at the cutting edge of making these models. They're enormously talented at what they do, brilliant people, strong moral convictions, many ways about how AI should be used. Most of the people I know who are at the cutting edge, who are probably going to become unbelievably wealthy from this, they didn't do it for the money. They did it for the mission. And in some ways, that's Anthropic's great success, I think, as a company watching it from the outside. But they've maintained this almost missionary aspect to their work. And that's attracted the best and the brightest people to want to be, part of their company. And those people, in turn, have improved the models and made it a more appealing product. So I think, the idea that it's going to be used for lethal autonomous weapons or mass surveillance is something they oppose. They didn't realize, probably, because they're not closely joined to what's happening at the Pentagon, that we already have a lot of autonomy. And we have incredible mass surveillance that, yes, AI is empowering. This is already a reality in our world today. And so I think the idea when it first came up that these could be used for these kind of techniques was just culturally foreign to them and morally reprehensible to them. And I share those. You shouldn't be using it for either of those kind of things we talked about. But they are being used for it in ways that they were, I think, probably caught flat-footed. Many people were about how they were being used. So they didn't want the product to be used for that. Unfortunately for the Pentagon, Claude is the premium product. That's what they want to use. It's what already been integrated to Palantir. And so they didn't have like a lot of plan Bs ready. So then you have this stalemate where, they try to coerce them and threaten their very existence, if you will, right, to use the product to their liking in some way. So I think it does presage this question of like you have the private sector developing a powerful technology from people who want to see it used in a fruitful way that benefits society, has dual uses. Other people want to use it for, more controversial purposes, defending the country at its best, maybe, reckless wars if you're from a certain political perspective. And, you want to not see your technology used for that. And so I think this is like presaging what's going to be a lot of battles in the future. And I think their concerns are right. I think the only thing I would say about it is like what they were concerned about has long been going on. AI supercharges a bit. They're not wrong to be concerned about that. And now, of course, we see OpenAI and Google have both stepped in. And the one thing I've been most kind of on Twitter talking to people about is the fig leaves people are putting in front of themselves are no protection at all. Like OpenAI and Gemini both said like, well, we're going to do these things. Well, then there's like a caveat at the bottom where the DoD says we're going to use it for all lawful uses. And that's right. That means they're going to do all the things that I said I don't really love personally. They're all lawful, right? That's the problem. The problem is the law permits things that I think shouldn't. So I think it's, it's going to augur in a lot of controversy over the next few decades. And the idea that the government is going to have to step in more. I mean, what you see just today, where we basically have a de facto licensing regime on Claude mythos, where, Anthropic wanted to release it to 70 new companies, according to the Wall Street Journal. The government prohibited them from doing that. Okay, once you're there, you're in kind of a government licensing regime of sorts. And so you're going to see more government involvement in this because the power is just too great for private sector actors alone to decide its use.
These things are different in the sense that they've grown to the point where they're almost like a necessary utility, service, right? And we have had a history here of saying, look, just because you politically agree with somebody or some community, you can't cut off their electricity or their water or anything else like that, right? It's like if they're not breaking the law, like, too bad. It's like you don't like what they're doing, but you can't cut them off from basic services or access to the public square. Isn't there an element of this happening there where it's like Claude's like, okay, well, you're using it for lawful purposes, but we don't like, those lawful purposes, so we're going to like withdraw the technology from you. Like it seems to be a similar type of...
I think it's a bit the inverse of that, I think. But we've never had a world where we compelled private companies to sell to the government, except under the Defense Production Act and maybe in wartime. It's entirely appropriate, it seems to me, in a free market economy, a free nation, to have Anthropic say, I don't want to do business with the government, period. Right? I'm working in other space. I work in the business sector, the enterprise sector. Right? I don't want to sell to the government at all. And it doesn't strike me as unconscionable that if you do sell to the government, you say, like, here's my terms. Right? I don't have to sell to you. There's other products. You can go to Grok or ChatGPT, Gemini. Meta's got a new product out there you can use, and we don't want you to use it.
Build your own.
Yeah, build your own. Well, not a bad idea. Palantir is going to build, an LLM at some point probably. And so the idea that like you can dictate the terms of your product, it's like that seems a reasonable thing to do in a commercial economy. These are the terms of the contract. If you don't like it. The problem you have here is the DoD, Department of War, desperately wants Claude. It's the best product on the line. It had already been integrated into their services, so there was a switching cost to them as well. And so they didn't like those terms. So they all got kind of crosswise on this kind of thing. But I think it's entirely appropriate. The Gemini use by the Department of War this week has got 600 Google employees to write a letter. I think it's entirely fine to me if Google said, as a company, don't do business with the Department of Defense. As a CEO, I would urge them to do business with the Department of Defense. I think that's very important personally. But I'm not offended in a free market if a company says like, the government market's just not one I want to be a part of. I think there's enough competition that it's no longer a utility. It's not the government shutting you out, turning off your electricity. It's like a private sector company, a vendor. If my lawn guy says, I don't want to be your lawn guy anymore, right? Because I don't like what you do or you believe or you're working in something. I just don't want it to be your vendor anymore. I shouldn't be able to compel him to be my lawn guy. I go find another lawn guy.
Oh, sure.
I think that's the analogy to where Anthropic is the Department of War in my mind. It's a vendor, and they have the right to dictate their terms if they want to.
Like, that's why I made the analogy to utility services, because, here in Connecticut, Con Edison's not allowed to cut off my power because I post stuff on Twitter, right? Like, that's just not something they can do. So there are certain services that grow to a scale where they become these utility or essential services, and you're just not allowed to deny people those services, based on like ideological disagreements, right? But I agree with you that that's not happening here, because it's not private individuals being denied the service, and it's also there are other competitors. And I think maybe part of what's happening here is back to what we talked about earlier, which is the lack of transparency in the terms. It's kind of like, here, I have this product, government, you can pay us X to use it. And then maybe new guardrails get introduced, right? And it's like, hey, we used to use it for this, and now it's not letting us, do some facial recognition thing. What the heck? Well, yeah, we introduced these guardrails. Like, well, that wasn't part of the four corners of the contract, because there just wasn't transparent, terms even behind the models. So I think your work to make that more robust and standardized and transparent, will probably help with this too, right?
Yeah, and I think, my ultimate criticism is for Congress. The operative controversy, the words of this controversy are the lawful uses of it. My objection, and I think Anthropic's objection too, and the Google employees, is what's lawful use is. And that's not for anyone to decide, but Congress. They should be able to say, a lawful use. That's the open question. Using AI for domestic surveillance and to assimilate records where they can make personal dossiers on you, which LLMs can really lubricate that creation of those.
Yeah.
That's lawful today. And that was a surprise to many people, I think, who worked at the labs, like what's lawful in surveillance. And the issue is like Congress should step in and say, in my mind, that's not lawful. And most members of Congress don't believe that's lawful. Same thing on lethal autonomy. Today, we have a lot of autonomy. The government's moving there rapidly. If you want to stop that, you should probably call Congress. Don't call Dario or Sam or Demis Hassabis about it. The problem is really what we consider lawful. And, the government will do everything that's lawful. It's almost its fiduciary obligation to do everything that's lawful to protect the country.
Right.
So yeah, Congress should step in. They're really the ones who need to remedy this. These kind of contract disputes are, I think, a diversion from the fact that Congress needs to step in and clarify these rules. And I think probably Anthropic would be happy if that happened. And I think the Department of War would, happily accede to those new rules.
There is this concentration risk, right? As you said, there's a handful of people and some hundreds of people that really are the backbone of this, emerging and vital. You kind of advocate for more distribution of that capability. At least it would be good if there was, more competition and more development. Is that right?
No, I think, there are forces in each direction. The concentration of companies, both in the semiconductor supply chain as well as in the kind of frontier model, so it makes regulation quite easy. If EUV machines were made in 50 different countries, China would have 1 million of them today and be cranking out 2-nanometer chips. The fact that there's one company making it allows the U.S. to, throttle that in some ways. And so, yes, the kind of concentration, oligopoly across that supply chain, the fact that there's really 5 frontier labs, maybe even just 3 if you really want to look closely at it, makes regulation easy. And to the extent I'm scared about the capabilities, that's a feature. Of course, I think a huge worry of mine is this concentration of power and wealth, right, in a very few people. And that's why, over the last few years, things like open sourcing, which has risks as well, I think net is a good thing, because this concentration of wealth and power is so kind of preening to me. I'm so concerned about that particular aspect. Same too, you have more companies. Competition drives capability. If we only had one OpenAI and you didn't have Anthropic and Google, right, the product would probably be a lot less, featureful than it is today, right? Their competition has improved the product immeasurably. And so competition helps improve the product. I think it also helps distribute the power, right? I don't want 1 or 2 people with incredible wealth and power I think that's just a dangerous thing. We have enough of that in this country without the AI guys coming and joining the fray.
Let me talk to you a bit about the open source angle because, and I'm not necessarily an expert, but if I remember correctly, in reading some of the regulations that California, was trying to introduce, like in AI, it would have basically made anybody that had a GitHub, project that was accessible to somebody in California would have to like comply with, regulations that they had passed. Like, I think that's correct. And is that a good thing? I mean, that seems to stifle innovation, right?
No, it's not a good thing. I have a GitHub repository, and no, I shouldn't be complying with California laws because I vibe code, casual websites at home about things. But it's easy. I mean, there's now really 5 companies that are making frontier models because of that concentration. To me, they're the ones that need to have the frontier models. Not even all their models. I don't care what Google Gemma is doing as an example. Those are things that should be out there. Roboticists should use them to do what they can. There are 5 companies at most making really frontier models. I do care deeply about what they are doing because we see with Mythos, new capabilities are arising, ones that are incredibly seen as dangerous by our own government. So yeah, to me, those are the folks who should do it. Mom and pops, small businesses. I think that's one of the big kind of canards, if you will, in this fight over policy up here. Like, oh, you're hurting a little tech. No, I just really want 5 companies, to send, tell me what they're doing. And if you can create novel pathogens or you can break down government systems with the capacity of a state actor, yeah, I do really want to know that. And, it's not just kind of, some small operator in Tulsa, Oklahoma who's doing that. It's 5 companies that are spending hundreds of billions of dollars, have attracted the smartest people in the world into a 6 square mile, 6 by 6 square mile area of the country and, are getting ready to upend it. So, yeah, I think it should be disseminated. I think the regulation should focus really on those kind of big actors who are driving capabilities.
I know that one thing that you advocate for is increased funding for academia, right? Like, because, hey, could they even afford to train a large scale model? Like, no. And actually, we've discussed this before in our server because we have quite a few academicians in there. And it turns out it's actually an interesting problem because on the one hand, you say like, oh, absolutely. Like we want academics to have more money so that they can afford to do tests on, large scale models. But on the other hand, necessity is the mother of innovation, right? And so sometimes by not having the funds, it forces them to find more efficient, clever ways, to do the testing. So there's this interesting trade-off between supplying them the money to do the things they need to do, but not discouraging them from innovating with less is more, right?
It's supposedly the problem the Chinese have, right, in their own way. It's like, they don't get the chips, and so they innovate on algorithms and architecture in some way, right? So yes, mother is the necessity of invention. And when you have, as the companies do now, right, these chips are coming out, right, they're emphasizing compute and scaling rather than some of the other things that might actually, help them if they didn't have those kind of resources. Yeah, I do think the universities need more. I think the challenge is this. You can get access to cloud computing now, so you don't actually need your own GPUs if you're at the University of Tulsa. You can go to, one of the providers of it out there. But if you're a top-level ML PhD graduating from MIT or Berkeley, Stanford, Caltech, the 5 or 6 places that are Carnegie Mellon, they're really turning these out, odds are, almost certainly, you're not going to go into academia at all. You're going to go work for a lab. And so, the number of people who are being siphoned off into the private sector, not into universities, is legion. It's very hard to hire people, even at the top institutions, who are very good at these kind of fields. The money is not only far superior at the companies, they actually have better access to data, and so they have a lot of things going for them. So I do think it's a problem. The universities, the public sector more generally, right, doesn't have access to like all the resources, all the career opportunities. The papers are now not even being published by the labs a lot of times. So the research is being kind of kept internal as well. This is a general purpose technology, as everyone defines it. It's probably the first one in history that's being developed behind closed doors, right? With very little public oversight and with the best minds going behind the doors. So yeah, I think there should be, I'm always excited personally by when I read Argonne is going to try to develop their own LLM for, the public sector. I'm like, yeah, that's like a good project. I'm for that. There's
Right.
I see efforts out of Zurich where they're trying to do kind of public AI and make it where government or civil society, NGOs, these kind of groups, nonprofits can have access to compute and have access to models that work for them. Yeah, I think that's all really important because I think again, the kind of non-lab world is not getting access to these kind of things, and the best minds, all the money, the best data, all goes to one of these companies. And again, that's remarkable in some ways, but the downstream effect of that is universities are really, I think, suffering these days.
The old days of supercompute, right?
Yeah.
Where the school had access to a supercomputer and researchers could kind of would have quotas of time that they could run on the supercomputers. You could probably arrange some type of sort of public sharing of large scale model training. It's a bit tricky, but still, I think you're absolutely right that more is needed, and it'd be interesting to have a lot of these kind of shared and co-developed models thriving. Right.
Yeah, I think it's like the broader question of public use of this. I mean, one of the things that Mythos, I think, brings us is this world where there's going to be increasingly bifurcated, if not separated into more elements of people who have access to top models and people who don't. We know the models are only getting better. So if Mythos is a problem, some of Mythos is going to even be better and more dangerous to us. So presumably it's going to be gated from the rest of us. And, the government's going to not let you even give it out to companies beyond the ones they personally approve. And again, this de facto licensing regime happens. If compute becomes scarcer and it becomes more expensive, I want the top model. I want to be able to do math and physics at home. My kids want to be able to do math and physics at home. If that's $500 a month, that's a small segment that has access to superhuman intelligence. My family may have it if you're certainly wealthy enough to do it, but it won't be ubiquitous. I think that actually becomes like a new form of like a digital divide, where if this is that transformative, I want everybody to have access to it. And so this whole question of like how the public sector gets it, how universities get it, how, the benefits of these incredible models are broadly distributed, I think is going to be a raging debate that is underappreciated right now in DC, as the models are certainly going to get more expensive, get more gated, and it's going to be by class whether you have access to them or not.
I personally was very surprised when DeepSeek released so much detail on their methodologies and these very like innovative algorithms, right? Because here's China, our adversary. Maybe they don't love their children, like even the Russians love their children too. Wow, they released all this valuable like information to the public. Wasn't that pleasantly surprising to you? And what do you think it says about how China interacts, let's say, in this world of AI with the West?
I think it does say two things, probably. One is these companies are not coterminous with the Chinese Communist Party. They're out in Hangzhou or somewhere doing their work. By all accounts, companies like Moonshot, you feel like you're in San Francisco. All the rooms are named after Pink Floyd songs, and I think people are smoking pot. And I know,
really?
I know that like the state apparatus is very powerful in China, but it's not identical. This is not some kind of paramilitary unit that's doing things directly for the People's Liberation Army and stuff like that. Which isn't to say it's not dangerous and tricky. It's just like there is, it's a complex society. With an incredible history and an amazing culture, and you can't just like have this uniform view that Xi Jinping announces some kind of diktat and the rest of the country all falls in line, right? We know that's far from the truth. So I think that's part of it. I think, this they had, especially when DeepSeek was kind of making a name for itself, maybe the government liked it because they were making China a champion. Suddenly, hey, China's in the game, and that was an amazing thing for them to do. And in some ways, that's how the culture should be. It's like it used to be a world where people were all publishing their papers, sharing them around, like latest cool stuff. In the U.S., we've gotten away from that as it's become more proprietary. So that's a good thing. China probably over time will retreat back to this more insulated standard that the U.S. is now adhering to. But I think it does show this question of like, what's happening in China is really remarkable. They have incredible engineers, a lot of ambition, data, plenty of energy. Energy is going to be the bottleneck in the U.S. probably. That's not a problem for them. And these companies are really incredible to watch.
Well, certainly some of the best games these days are coming out of Chinese studios. They're phenomenal, producing phenomenal games. I'm glad you brought up, this is kind of unrelated to the show topic, but you brought up, hey, it's this massive culture that has this huge, vibrant history. I think that's one thing that I would like to encourage, my fellow Americans to think about, is that when you talk about China, so when a Chinese person hears the word China, they're not thinking about the CCP, okay? They're thinking about this rich thousands of years of history that they've learned, that they know about. We only have a history of, some hundreds of years, right? And so to the extent that we do want to criticize things that, the CCP is doing, it's always good to make that distinction. It's like, okay, there's these CCP policies or whatever, very different from the people of China, right?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, Chinese culture is remarkable. The history is extraordinary. Right?
Yeah.
Their contributions to the world are amazing. And so,
phenomenal.
Yes, it's important to recognize the CCP is not China. And, like it is in the U.S., where everyone thinks of the current president. You come to Oklahoma, it's like a different world. And, people have very different views about it. We're not homogeneous, and have a single view about anything. It's a very complicated place. I'm sure China is. And so I think, if anything, we should learn lessons from what they're doing there and venerate what they have achieved as a culture, without any love for the CCP, of course, or any illusions about what Xi's ambitions might be that could be inimical to those in the U.S. But one can only hold a candle and say, China's an extraordinary place, an amazing culture.
Yeah, and to that end, we talked a lot of the show about using AI to fight our wars, but to a large extent, wars happen because of a failure of earlier diplomatic stages, right? So what, if any, future do you see for AI in actually helping to bridge understanding between cultures, or even political negotiations, diplomatic ventures? Is the U.S., is our government putting effort into utilizing AI tools to prevent wars as much as it is into fighting wars?
I don't think we are, to be honest with you. I mean, you can think ambitiously about this, where maybe AI systems become a common source of knowledge. The Chinese are reading DeepSeek. I'm reading DeepSeek. I use all the Chinese models a lot in my home in Tulsa. Moonshot, Kimmy, DeepSeek, Quen. They're great, remarkable models. Maybe they give us a common operating picture, give us insights, that get us out of our kind of insularity a bit. Maybe that's the best hope for it on this. I do think the government should do a lot more kind of track 2 talks with Chinese scientists. We should be engaging them more. Again, the Soviets are a great example of this. We had a lot of talks, constant scientific communication, discussions back and forth, even when we were at each other's throats and the future of Earth hung in the balance, right? We still did those things. And it doesn't make any sense.
Can you educate me? What is a track 2 talk?
The track 2 are when people who are former government officials, usually not in government today, are over there talking. I've done this a lot on the military side. As a former Department of Defense official, I would go to Shanghai or Beijing, and you would talk to also former defense officials there. We still have lots of friends, and so we would talk and discuss the American perspective. They would give the Chinese perspective, and then you'd come back and you'd tell the people who were in office, this guy who's still best friends with the defense minister, believes this, and here's his take on things, or his interpretation of American actions. So it's a low stakes way for people in governments to talk to one another. They usually are the preview for kind of talks among the principals themselves. So that's what a track 2 talk is. And we should be doing those in AI. And people are trying to do that, getting Stuart Russell or Bengio over to China to talk about the Western perspective, to learn about how do the Chinese think about X risk, about discrimination, about the military applications of this. What do they think? Because I think, coming back to the Soviet example, which I brought up several times, there was a time in my life when I was fascinated by this question, and they were opening up the archives after the Soviet Union fell. And a lot of historians were going in and writing these alternative histories of the Cold War, looking at the actual papers of the Soviets. And they would evaluate, what did the Russians really think about this? We had this view in America of how they interpreted the world. Right. And what did they really think? What were the Politburo minutes about this? Or what was the army writing about this kind of stuff? And it turns out we got it all wrong. mostly, right? We totally misinterpreted a lot of what the Soviets were doing, and saw aggression where there wasn't, or we saw nothing when there actually was aggression. And to me, that's like, I think, a powerful lesson about the Chinese. It is a different culture, one rich, proud, vibrant, on the come, right? And have no illusions that we actually understand like what they think about these things. And don't fall into the trap of either marrying yourself or also just presuming, right, that they're, nefarious and evil-minded, and are ready to destroy the world to achieve their ambitions. Recognize that they're a competitor minimally, an adversary maybe, right? But try to like understand them better. And these track 2 talks are part of that. But across the board, Americans should be trying to understand China a lot more. That's a huge weakness for us. I do think we're in this stage now of where we are just kind of projecting our worst fears onto them.
I mean, don't you think AI could go a long way to help in diplomatic modeling? I mean, or diplomatic understanding? I mean, why not? Like, it seems like these tools could be directed at like I said, preventing war and furthering understanding rather than just fighting war, right?
I'd love to see that done. It's not a typical American constituency. Like, what agency of the government does that? Perhaps the State Department or someone,
Yeah.
The Department of Defense, right? Everything's a weapon for them, right? And that's how they see these kind of tools. But yes, I agree. Finding ways to common understanding. There's like a school of thought you can think like in a different place in the multiverse where we treat the development of AI like we do public health. We share immunizations. If the U.S. or China cured cancer tomorrow, of course we would share it with China and Europe and Africa and the globe. It would be an amazing advance, and you would share it. And they, in turn, would probably share it with us. And the idea being like, you could see AI going in that direction. That doesn't seem to be the trajectory we're on. But nonetheless, it remains kind of a distant dream of mine that is like how we would think of the problem, or at least open ourselves to the possibility of that without defaulting into this kind of arms race mentality where AI is a weapon and we have to master it. A race to what? What does victory look like in this arms race? What lane am I in? Right. What kind of trophy do I get when I achieve it? Do I get a Romulan cloaking device, on this that leads, for that forever? I cannot be challenged. Like, what's AI going to do that renders war obsolete? What does winning look like? Yeah. That's why arms races historically are a byword for disaster. And we should get ourselves out of an arms race if we're in one.
Speaking of which, I know that one of the pillars on the site is upskilling government. And I'm curious, I mean, of course, there are the testimonies that happen. Those usually seem more performative rather than, anything else. But I'm curious what actually happens in the halls, behind the scenes. Like, how do congressmen learn more about AI? Is it just, educating yourself by going to YouTube and watching, of course, machine learning street talk? Or do you have experts kind of milling around in the hallways there to discuss topics with you, answer questions, deep dive anytime you want? What's it look like?
Well, one observation about the state of play and then how people try to get around the problems that the state of play presents to them. So I remember when I was first elected to Congress 20 years ago now, the Congressional Management Foundation gives you this book of kind of like how to be a congressman, how to run your office, what to expect day to day. And I remember reading in the back, they had a survey of the existing Congress. And they said, how much time a day do you have to read and to get smarter about issues? And the answer was 17 minutes. And of course, members of Congress are dealing with everything in domestic policy, international policy, local questions. So they're overwhelmed by just the number of subjects they have to understand a bit. Mm-hmm. So it's a world, I tell folks, if you want to go into politics, develop your human capital before you show up, because you only draw it down once you're there. That being said, on these technical questions, there's been a huge effort from everybody from the AAAS to various nonprofits to put technically minded people on the Hill, fellowships for mid-career scientists, maybe to leave their academic position or even industry, come work on the staff of a House member or senator. Industry's paid for some of those. Various nonprofits have done so. Very important. And so now if you go to most of the offices in the Senate, they'll have a fellow there who has some kind of superlative education, PhD from an elite school, expert in computer science, machine learning, biotech perhaps, who are there to advise them about this, both to get smart about politics when they go back out maybe to their commercial or academic position, but also to give advice. And so you have that going on as well. And the halls are swimming with people now, for better or worse, lobbyists from the tech companies, but also folks from nonprofits. Civil society now has a huge presence on AI debates in DC. So there's a lot of incoming messaging, but it does come back to that constraint I mentioned. Their time is very, very limited. It's going to be very hard to become an expert on AI when you're in office. So you either have to come in with that kind of background or have really good staff, or make it such a priority for yourself that at the expense of all the other issues, healthcare and transportation, that you choose to do that. There are a couple of members like that. Don Beyer from Virginia, terrific member. He's probably in his 70s. He's going back right now to George Mason University and getting a PhD in machine learning. And he's a very successful guy, cool. Very wealthy because he's interested. Now that's somebody who's made that a focus. But other people, you come to Congress because you care about something else. And so you have to have that staff around them, and building up a staff ecosystem and a civil society ecosystem to combat and sometimes complement the lobbyists from the tech sector itself has been, I think, an important part of what the last couple of years has brought to DC.
Okay. So, and I see that individual, congressmen and women would have, staff and people who may be experts, but is there also a shared pool, almost like an internal think tank that all of them can access to I don't know, vet ideas or talk about the impacts of policies, a shared pool of experts, or no?
Not really. Certain segments of each party will have something like that. Like there's a Republican study committee for very conservative members of the Republican Party who has that kind of shared infrastructure, their own staff. They're almost an in-house think tank, if you will. But that's rare. Newt Gingrich, when he took power in 1994, there was an Office of Technology Policy that was kind of the in-house congressional think tank on tech policy, but he got rid of that in 1994, and it's never been brought back. So that's the challenge. It's there's no outside, but congressionally kind of authorized group to do it. Congressional Research Service can provide you background information. Yeah. Again, you have access to a lot of people in civil society and think tanks, but there's nobody, outside your own staff really who's thinking big thoughts. And a lot of times your staff is also caught up in the minutia of, day-to-day kind of fighting and stuff. So that's, I think, one of the challenges is that there's no kind of brain trust that can think big thoughts and then inform the parties about that.
And do you think this is a gap? I mean, is it something that we should have?
No, it is a gap for sure.
Okay.
It's something that used to exist. It's been taken away as these technical questions become even more important than they were 30 years ago. Yes, we have to have groups like that who are congressionally chartered, not subject to influence either by civil society, where you have philanthropists giving money there. Sometimes they're slanted in their views. The lobbyists, of course, are carrying the water for their respective companies. Right? To actually have someone like, hey, you're in the public service here. You're on the government payroll. Your job is to think these kind of ideas through for us and give us good ideas. I think that would be a powerful, powerful tool. We need to do that. It would make our government more effective. Again, you have groups like Republican Study Group, kind of the Progressive Caucus in the House of the left-wing members. There's small groups that do this, but you don't really have one that's incredibly high-powered with really the best people in it. You have so many people who listen to you who are influential in the industry. And, I think I am in many ways somewhat gloomy about the way this is all going to go for us. Because whether our democracy can handle this incredible technology, whether people can find meaning where work is scarce, whether the benefits of AI are going to be, even if not equally distributed, at least widely distributed. I think there's very little in recent American history that thinks we're going to get those kind of questions right. And it does go to, your question about what one should study and what disciplines are important. When I argue with people like Seb Creer at Google DeepMind or Dean Ball, who was at the Trump administration, I find we agree about the technology exactly. Where we disagree are about these questions of how does government respond? What can government do? What should government do, even if capable? What's the role of government in a society like ours? And these are really live questions that are actually the most important ones today. And I think the big fear that I've had, and it drives a lot of the work we do here, is that the AI industry can be its own worst enemy. People loathe it. I see polling every day, political polling. It's deeply unpopular, and that's not a good thing for our country. And there's a lot of folks who have pitchforks who are just over the horizon coming after this whole sector. Many of them would shut it down entirely. And they want to do so because they don't give affirmative answers to those questions I answered earlier. They're like, This is a project of the elite, for the elite. They're building a data center in my backyard that's going to maybe change the environment, maybe raise my electricity prices, and whose sole purpose is to take my job away. And then I turn on the TV and there's a lab leader saying, I'm here to like disrupt your world, irrevocably disrupt your world. And I think the fact that society, the US, has lost faith in the project is extraordinarily damaging to what is a very important project with many, many, many upsides. And that's just, we're in a perilous place. And if we don't do something to regain that trust, there's going to be a lot of people, who are radically opposed to this project and, do their best to, if not shut it down, stymie it. And that's why I said, I think this next few years are really important. And to your listeners who are probably doing machine learning day in, day out, their voices need to be heard. They need to be heard inside their companies to advocate for the right kind of public policy. They need to be heard outside of it. And, their task, all of our task perhaps, is to convince Americans that, yeah, this is actually a good thing. Because the truth is right now, most Americans don't think it's a good thing.